Good evening, traveller of quiet hours. Shall I keep you company with a long, unhurried tale? Settle back, loosen your shoulders, and let the day fold itself into silence. Follow the silver thread I cast across the dark, and step with me softly into the older night where breath and legend mingle. Today's story will be about vampires and how they came to be, their whole life. Before you start, please write where you are from and what time it is where you are. Night settles like dark silk across the old lands, where bread cooled on windowsills and threshing floors whispered under straw. In the hush between ember and cockcrow villagers from the Baltic pines to the Black Sea listened for a second heartbeat under the world. They named it Wampies, Upio, Striziga, one mirror with many shards, each turned toward the same thirst. We will follow the long river of their becoming as walkers along the bank. The theme is simple as hunger and complicated as love. How such beings came to be, why they return in ages of doubt and smoke, and whether they breathe still in our century of glass. Come without bravado, carrying a candle cupped against the wind. Before the word hardened into wampir and went riding on the postal roads of empires, there was only a sense, the way a field senses frost, that some dead do not settle. A body might lie, yet its shadow keeps moving. A mouth is sewn, yet a murmur sifts through the stitches. The Slavic night learned to tell the difference. It watched the ones born with a call, the ones whose teeth showed early, the seventh child of a seventh child. It marked those who died strangely, alone in snow, at the river's jealous bend, under an unabsolved sky. Animals noticed first. Dogs stood rigid at empty corners. A mother, feeling watched while plating onions beneath the eaves, added one more knot to the red thread on the lintel, and said nothing. Some say the first vampire was a border crosser, not of nations but of states of being, a wanderer who refused the soft oblivion of burial. Others say the earth, curious, returned a man for a second harvest to see whether life tasted different when stolen. Whatever the beginning, people traced patterns, milk soured, children slept too deeply, and a young woman woke with blue shadows on her throat as if a thistle had kissed her there. Day offered reasons, night coherence. In the hush after prayer, mouths told how the suspect dead grew ruddy beneath the soil, how nails lengthened like patient knives, and how a faint chewing could be heard if you pressed your ear to the mound. A tale is a net. Pull it long enough and it begins to hold water. It is easy to think the vampire is only a theatre of blood, but in these first murmurings it was also a theatre of order. Fields depend on seasons, houses on thresholds, villages on songs that end on the tonic. Death too should have its cadence and final chord. When the dead broke that rhythm and kept time with their own pulse, the measures slipped, apples rolled from bowls, a millstone turned against an unmoving stream. Here the vampire was not a gentleman in a high collar, but a reminder that the border between hush and havoc is narrow and easily scuffed. The elders taught that hunger can be ceremonial. They watched graves during the lean months and listened for the soil's small rumours. If cattle thinned and bread went coarse, they convened by the moon with spade and proverb. They opened the ground and tested the pact between living and dead. Sometimes the face below looked as if from sleep. Sometimes the mouth was stained as if by berries. They turned the body, pierced the heart with hawthorn, cut the knees to slow wandering, and dusted the mouth with poppy seeds to keep it forever counting. No act was merely cruel. Each was a treaty, a ritual to quiet a rhythm that had begun to override the village song. The threshold was the scene of many survivals. The revenant, precise with names, came only to the door and called softly, once, then again. If a drowsy voice answered, the cord between worlds tightened, so people learned to sleep through their own names, to let the darkness speak and give no answer. They scattered millet on the sill and placed a broom for a sudden chore, because counting and sweeping are the lullabies of compulsions. The dusk learned their habits, so did the ones who tested them. Across valleys the returning took different weights. In one region it was light and quick, almost wind, caught by sieves hung on pegs. In another it sat upon the chest and pressed until dreams leaked out as sweat. Yet the omens braided across distance, crossroads where choices fail, running water that confounds, knots that remember, flames that will not keep a wick. Even the sun, when it returned, felt like a verdict. Beneath custom lay older questions that wore no uniforms. What makes a person unable to stop? Is thirst born, taught, or imposed by an unfinished grief? If a village misreads sorrow as danger, does it create the very monster it fears and then prosecute its own invention? The earliest tales lack courtrooms, they have only a chorus of necessary acts. Listen closely and you hear a gentler music within, that some hungers are pleas for remembrance, that the unloved dead return not to consume, but to be counted among us once more, if only by name. We begin here at the rim of the first rumour, because the rest of the tale widens from this centre. From farms and thatched eaves the myth moves into princely halls, into scripture margins and broadsheets, into new streets where lamplight invents fresh shadows. It will change yet endure, and when, far ahead, we ask whether such beings walk our present pavements, we will ask it without panic, as those who kept watch before us did, hand steady, breath slow. For now let the road lie white with moonlit dust, the river practice its long pronunciation of forever, and a quiet grave dream of being a door. Yes, so the door learned the weight of footsteps, and the grave learned patience. The earth, old and practical too, kept both lessons. In the Slavic night, a rumour is a seed. Left alone, it becomes a field. The tale of the thirsting dead sprouted along fences and roads, sent shoots under nursery windows. Wooden spoons clicked, the stove breathed, and someone muttered the names that matter in the dark. Hawthorn, poppy, broom, thread, threshold. Simple words, behaving like locks and keys when evening folds itself around a house. Some say the first to test that peace was not a prince or witch, but a man whose life had been a fraction too full. He mended things that were cracked, pails, songs, marriages. When he died, the village felt each blessing diminished. Even the river ran with less conviction. They laid him in linen, gave bread for the road, spoke his name with a door's finality, yet the next weeks creaked like a cart with no driver. No one accused him. Love-first villagers do not rush to name monsters. They watch. A child started counting crumbs and could not stop. The grindstone rotated backward. A lantern flame leaned toward the floor as if considering it. Elders nodded, remembering measures for such rhythms. A thing that cannot rest seeks a cadence. A hunger seeks a channel. If the living do not provide the channel, the hunger will dig one with its own red hands. What births a vampire? Some say it is a birth folded twice. A child slick with caul who slipped through the world's first net, and therefore slips through others. Some say it is a death missing the last word, a body unwept or misnamed, buried without the river's permission. Others, sterner, say it is a choice, a knitting of self around the pit of appetite until the mask becomes a face. The old words do not agree, but they circle the same hearth. The vampire rises where the pact between boundary and longing, phrase and grief keeps walking past the appointed stopping place. Nature is a second story stitched on the inside of the first. The revenant is not merely a thief of warm blood, it is a keeper of accounts. It tallies what was withheld, wronged, neglected, and visits thresholds that failed it to ask for interest. That is why doors creak after such burials, why grain spoils in sacks tied by rushed hands, why lovers wake feeling audited, yet there is pity in it. The dead who refuse oblivion are often those who believed their labour welded the village together. Unable to imagine the work ending, they return with the unspent momentum of duty and sorrow. But thirst is lawless and less taught, so the village taught it. On the third moon they opened the grave and turned the body, laying it upon a quieter story. Hawthorn found the stalled drum of the heart, and annotated it. Poppy filled the mouth with stars to count. Millet along the floor laid a night-long arithmetic until desire could not reach morning. At the threshold a broom waited, its bristles an ocean of small requests. Compulsion is a lullaby, the night dozed to it. Running water drew a brighter line than any fence. The river said no to what had learned to say yes too often. Crossroads too were stern teachers. Every choice invited another until dawn arrived. Stove fire and salt were cousins of law. The vampire, quick with names, learned caution before these elders and etiquette of night. These early nights were not yet theatre. The thirst wore working clothes and smelled of horses. It pressed on the chest with a grief like winter hay, scratchy, patient, heavy with the past summer's light. It moved along sills dusted with poppy and paused at doors that remembered its name. Inside the word vampire, a heart knocks from the wrong side. Upio, upir, strigiga. Neighbours who borrow flour, not identical masks but kin. One counts, one dreams, one resents the unburied. all share the arithmetic of longing, the need to be tallied, named, settled. Was there a first of firsts? The songs are coy. They point toward marsh fire and wolves, toward a winter that would not end, toward a siege when bread became memory. In such scarcity, everything learns a second mouth. The tale insists that someone declined to be finished and taught the knight anew bargaining. Perhaps the earth, thrift-minded, returned him to collect what was owed. Perhaps he returned because he loved too thoroughly to let go. Love is a hunger with a better vocabulary. It can explain even the borrowing of breath. And do they exist still? The question hovers above each paragraph like a moth above a candle. We will answer it with the patience of the fields. First, we must understand how thirst learned manners, how villages negotiated with the dark until custom became law and law became solace. Then we may look up from parchment toward newer streets, where light pools in blue windows and doors lock with metal tongues, and ask whether the old etiquette still calls the night to heal. For the widow who woke with wheat-shadowed skin kept lighting a lamp and setting an extra bowl on the table, as if hospitality might be a cure. She wore a thread around her wrist that her mother called a fence. On the 7th night, the dog slept by the door with one eye open, and the broom leaned as though listening. When the floorboard at the threshold sighed, she did not answer. Counting began in the silence, soft as insects, steady as far rain. The night learned its task. The village, waiting, learned the shape of the answer that would soon arrive on careful feet. The night, having been taught its arithmetic, began to carry it forward as if reciting lessons aloud. Counting was not merely a distraction but a covenant between silence and vigilance. The broom by the door, the millet scattered like fallen stars, the knots tied in thread across lintels, these became the grammar of survival. The vampire, quick with names yet slower with riddles, paused before each of these woven obstacles. Its hunger, vast as fields after harvest, met the small and stubborn insistence of numbers, of tasks unfinished, of patterns it could not step past. Thus the creature became not only a terror but a pupil, schooled by villages that whispered prayers into stitches and chores. And still, questions wandered like cattle unpenned. What is it in the body that keeps it restless? Is it the flesh rebelling against rot, or the soul too burdened with longing, refusing to release the frame that once held it? The Slavic mind, tuned to omens, never divided flesh and spirit completely. To them, the body could remember what the soul had failed to forget, and memory itself could ferment into thirst. In this way, the vampire was seen not only as monster but as testimony, proof that remembrance, when left untempered, could congeal into appetite. The forest was a witness. Pines leaned, listening to midnight footfalls that had no owner. Wolves, cousins to the revenant in their patience and appetite, circled the edges of fields but rarely approached the hamlets where fire and ritual kept order. It was said that wolves respected the uproar, that they carried fragments of its scent and did not contest its hunting. The raven, black minister of thresholds, perched near burial grounds and tilted its head when the earth shifted strangely. Even streams seemed to hesitate, slowing as if reluctant to carry whispers farther than the next bend. The world collaborated with the myth, teaching villagers that existence itself was porous, stitched together with fragile cords that could be tugged loose by death too restless to lie still. And so arose the sense of contagion, that the vampire was not merely one figure, but a possibility woven into many. A neighbour bitten in secrecy might carry the thirst like an ember under skin. A widow kissed by shadows might open her eyes in the grave with lips that no longer prayed but begged. The fear was never of one, but of one becoming many. And this fear thickened the night like fog, each hearth defending its circle of warmth, each door heavy with charms. The rituals multiplied became layers of defence, an architecture of belief, as sturdy as stone walls. There were tales of villages where the earth itself seemed unable to rest. Mounds sank, and each spring bones surfaced as if pushed upward by unseen hands. In those places, watchers kept vigil with iron stakes, their tips heated red. The air was thought to grow thick with sighs, and children were warned never to wander alone lest a shadow with familiar features beckon from behind a tree. Yet, alongside dread, pity still wandered. Old women, stirring cauldrons, sometimes murmured that perhaps the vampires did not drink out of malice but out of exile, thirsty because they had been severed from both earth and heaven, denied both the sleep of the grave and the grace of the sky. To feed was simply to insist on presence. To return was to cry that they were not yet finished. The vampire in these tellings was not merely a predator, it was also a question directed back toward the living. Have you buried rightly? Have you remembered fully? Have you mended what was broken before the final breath? For each forgotten debt, each word unsaid, each grudge unhealed, the night might raise a mirror in the form of a restless dead. In that mirror, villagers glimpsed their own failings, refracted through eyes that no longer closed. The dead man who mended buckets and quarrels returned in dreams. Villagers whispered he walked not with menace but with confusion, wandering into barns as if to repair a yoke, pausing by gates as though to mend hinges. Yet when he leaned too close to sleepers, their lips paled and their strength faltered by morning. Hunger is cunning, it borrows the gestures of love. The people, torn between affection and fear, love argued with survival, and survival carried the sharper tool. So they opened his grave, finding his cheeks still flushed and his eyes half open as though reluctant to shut. The hawthorn was driven home and the ground sighed with a kind of relief. Yet those who remembered his laughter wept, for in ending his hunger they wondered if they had ended the last echo of his care. The myth rippled outward, taken by traders across borders and scribes into margins. Words travelled faster than footsteps, and soon stories of Upper and Strezhiga sat beside chronicles of wars and harvests. Foreign ears, less schooled in the local dialects of fear, reshaped the being into something more distant, less bound by village chores and more by Gothic grandeur. But within the hamlets the vampire remained intimate, flesh of their dead, breath of their kin, sorrow in familiar eyes. It was never fully other, it was too close, too recognizably human to be dismissed as mere beast. And so it is that in these earliest chapters, the vampire is not yet the aristocrat of later imagination, but the neighbour, the friend, the one whose absence was unbearable and whose return was unmanageable, a paradox at the heart of night. The villagers learned to walk that paradox carefully, balancing fear and tenderness, always aware that the boundary between protection and cruelty was as thin as frost on a window. The broom leaned, the millet scattered, the poppy counted, and still the hunger stirred. Now the tale leans forward, as stories do when the path curves. The vampire, once confined to quiet graves and whispered charms, will soon press against broader walls, testing the strength of cities, sanctuaries and courts. Its thirst will not remain in hamlets alone, and when it steps beyond, it will carry with it the memory of these first negotiations, the counting, the knots, the unanswered names, and reshape them into something larger, darker, and more enduring. In time, the hunger, no longer confined to thatched hamlets and silent barns, pressed outward like mist seeking new hollows. Villages that once seemed self-contained discovered that the unrest of their dead could not be tethered by fences or even rivers. Roads were opening, roads made of commerce, of wars that churned populations together, of letters that carried not just news but dread. And so the vampire began to shift its form in the imagination, adapting to the new scale of human fear. It grew taller in story, darker in presence, its footsteps echoing not only on creaking boards but in the minds of rulers and priests who saw in it a challenge to their authority. The countryside still whispered of calls and poppy seeds, but cities required other protections. Stone cathedrals lifted their ribs toward the heavens, and within them sermons took note of the restless dead. The vampire, once addressed through spade and hawthorn, was now named from the pulpit, folded into discourse about sin, heresy, and the frailty of souls unshriven. In this light, the creature's thirst was no longer only for blood, but for the spiritual marrow of a people. To die unconfessed, to be buried without rites, was to risk a return that mocked both heaven and earth. And so the myth found a new chamber in which to breathe, the solemn aisles of doctrine. Yet even in sanctified language, the creature retained its intimacy. Chronicles speak of parishes where a villager's body refused decay, lips moist, eyes glinting with a half-familiar fire. Priests ordered vigils at gravesides, candles trembling against stone, psalms muttered through clenched jaws. But when the cattle still sickened, when shadows still leaned at doors, iron was summoned. Wooden stakes were sharpened, axes drawn, and graves disturbed beneath holy banners. In these acts of mingled faith and fear, the vampire became a hinge between the spiritual and the carnal, uniting prayers and blades in one trembling gesture. The legend's power lay not only in terror but in recognition. The vampire wore the faces of neighbours, of kin, of children buried too young. In its gaze, the people saw both their own mortality and the suspicion that death was not a finish but a distortion. That knowledge, too sharp for daily speech, was carried in stories like a shard wrapped in cloth. In evenings by hearth, children listened wide-eyed as elders described the way the ground could betray its sleepers. They learned to honor thresholds not as wood alone, but as lines between worlds. They learned that memory could be perilous when it clung too hard. And slowly across borders, the rumor thickened. In Polish chronicles, in Russian Bylina, in Czech whispers, the vampire threaded itself with new names yet recognizable breath. Scholars of empire collected the stories, copying them into margins of travelogues and treaties. To those distant readers, the creature seemed exotic, a curiosity of the wild east. But to those who lived beneath the same moon that silvered their fields, it was no ornament. It was the neighbor who still pressed at doors, the sigh in barns, the silence too heavy at wells. The vampire's symbolic role began to widen. It was not only an omen of personal grief, but a mirror for entire communities. In times of plague, when death outpaced burial, stories of vampires swelled like floodwaters, corpses piled too quickly, and the living feared contagion not only of disease but of unrest. Villages spoke of the dead rising because they had been abandoned in haste, their rituals unfulfilled, their dignity cut short by terror. Hunger, in this sense, was the shape of unfinished mourning. The vampire became both explanation and embodiment. Why the pestilence spread, why grief kept gnawing, why the world itself felt unsettled. Some tales gave the revenant a voice. They spoke of it confessing loneliness, of begging for recognition, of demanding bread or milk left at thresholds. These offerings, humble as they were, revealed the thin line between appeasement and survival. To feed the vampire was to court danger, to deny it was to risk wrath. Yet villagers, caught between fear and pity, sometimes laid crumbs on windowsills or whispered a name into the night as though acknowledgement might soothe the unquiet spirit. In these gestures, the vampire became not just predator but petitioner, a being with desires shaped like wounds. Still, the hunger was not to be trusted. Even when portrayed as confused or sorrowful, the revenant's thirst could not be sated without cost. Blood, warm and immediate, was its chosen currency, and so the rituals of protection deepened. Iron nails hammered into coffins, stones placed in mouths, bodies burned when whispers grew too insistent. Each act was a negotiation, sometimes gentle, sometimes brutal, but always underscored by the same truth that the dead, if unmoored, would not rest until the living compelled them. As the centuries turned, the vampire's tale gathered weight like a rolling stone, each retelling adding new texture. It was no longer confined to burial grounds but walked into courts of power, into chronicles of war, into the margins of philosophy. Could hunger itself be immortal? Could grief? Could memory? These questions lingered like mist, even in the minds of those who dismissed the stories, and the people, though soothed by ritual and watchful habits, never ceased listening for the sigh at the door, the faint rustle of counting beyond the threshold. For the night is a patient teacher. It does not hurry its lessons, and its students are many. The vampire, once a whisper among barns, now carried within it the weight of both faith and empire, and the path ahead, longer roads, wider fears, would shape it into a figure still more enduring, one that would not remain confined to Slavic soil but stride into foreign imaginations. The hunger, it seems, was not only for blood but for story, for remembrance, for perpetuity. And like all hungers, it would find its way into whatever vessel the world offered next. Stories, like rivers, swell when rains of unrest fall. Wars, plagues and migrations churned the soil of Europe, and into that loosened ground the tale of the vampire sank its roots more deeply. Soldiers returning from borderlands spoke of villages where graves were watched as closely as gates, where whole families whispered prayers against the footsteps of their own kin. Merchants carrying salt and furs carried also rumours, letting them slip into taverns where strangers listened with wine-heavy ears. Thus the creature, once tethered to a narrow circle of fields and hearths, began to stretch its shadow across kingdoms. It was in these restless centuries that the vampire's presence became sharper, more confrontational. No longer only the sorrowful neighbour or confused revenant, it was painted in stories as deliberate, even cunning. Chronicles describe figures that rose from the grave not with bewilderment, but with a cold awareness, eyes glinting like embers under ash. They sought out thresholds not just to be acknowledged, but to test them, to measure the strength of human vigilance. Hunger acquired a face of resolve, and with it came fear of transgression that once invited, such a being might not be banished easily again. The rituals deepened, growing harsher with the scale of anxiety. Where once a thread tied across the lintel sufficed, now entire communities convened to exhume and judge their dead. Bodies were turned, pierced, burned, drowned, or dismembered, each act bearing the weight of collective dread. Yet beneath the severity lingered the same tenderness, for each revenant was someone's child, spouse, or sibling. Villagers wept even as they wielded the stake, knowing they struck at familiar flesh. It was grief made iron, sorrow hardened into hawthorn. The vampire pressed them to confront the paradox of love turned dangerous, memory turned threatening. Such acts did not remain in silence. Priests recorded them, nobles heard them, and foreign officials puzzled over them when reports crossed borders. By the early modern era, entire commissions were dispatched to investigate. The Habsburg Empire, wary of disorder in its Slavic provinces, received accounts of revenants troubling peasants, and officials rode out not with poppy seeds but with quills. They wrote testimonies of villagers insisting that the dead rose ruddy and well-fed, that livestock wasted while one man's cheeks glowed as if from secret banquets beneath the earth. These documents, half incredulous, half dutiful, carried the tale into libraries where scholars weighed it as if it were coin. And so the vampire began to live a double existence. In villages it was still the sigh at the door, the weight on the chest, the whisper of a name unwise to answer. In courts and chancelleries it became an object of debate, its very absurdity demanding attention. Was it delusion, or fraud, or proof of something darker than reason allowed? Learned men argued, but their parchment did not still the nights of peasants who scattered millet and slept lightly, listening for the creak of steps. Two worlds overlapped, one of ink, the other of fear. The vampire, cunning as ever, lived in both. It was also in this period that the creature's image began to change shape, swelling with new symbolism. The vampire came to embody transgression, not just of death, but of boundaries, sacred to order. It was accused of spreading disease, of leeching the vitality of whole communities, of mocking the sacraments. In some stories it sought not only blood, but the corruption of souls, drinking faith itself until prayers felt brittle on the tongue. Thus the myth grew heavier, cloaked in both spiritual and political dread, a spectre that threatened not just bodies but entire ways of life. Yet within these darker portrayals an old tenderness remained. Half hidden, elders still told of revenants who seemed bewildered, who lingered near their homes with gestures of care. A mother was said to return only to brush her child's hair while it slept, though the child paled each dawn. A husband stood at the window, gazing with longing, his face beautiful and terrible with thirst. These were no longer neighbours mending yokes, but the echo of intimacy still haunted the myth. Hunger and love braided together, inseparable, each making the other more perilous. The people, as always, responded with invention. They carved protective signs into doors, wove charms into garments, and invented new lullabies that doubled as wards. Children sang them without always knowing their deeper weight, but in their melodies survival was threaded. The vampire taught villagers to live with layers of precaution, to make ritual not only in church but in daily gestures, how bread was broken, how lamps were tended, how graves were walked around rather than over. In these habits the dead were given their due space, and the living preserved their fragile order. Still, the vampire was no longer content to remain bound to small geographies. As armies marched and merchants travelled, so too did the legend. It began to cast its shadow upon lands far from its Slavic roots, acquiring new languages, new costumes, new interpretations. Yet its heart remained unchanged. Hunger disguised as memory, love sharpened into thirst, the refusal of the grave to accept silence. Wherever the tale settled, it retained this essence, as if the creature itself carried its own inheritance across borders. The world was beginning to change, with cities swelling and old certainties crumbling. In that shifting light the vampire found fertile soil. No longer only a revenant in the village night, it began to stand as a question for the broader human condition. What do we do when what we loved refuses to rest? What happens when grief itself grows teeth? The answers, carried in rumour and ritual, would continue to spread, reaching even farther into lands where the old counting charms were unknown, but where the fear of unfinished death was just as sharp. And so the story leans once more forward. The vampire, shaped by villages and sermons, by courts and chronicles, would soon step beyond even these boundaries. The myths now thickened would mingle with imagination across Europe, feeding not only on blood but on ink, music and art. Its hunger would become cultural as well as carnal, and though the rituals of millet and hawthorn remained, another stage awaited, larger and louder, where the vampire would be cloaked not only in fear but in fascination. Fascination is a second kind of hunger, and soon the vampire discovered it could feed not only on throats but on imaginations. Across Europe, the 18th century unfurled like a tapestry of contradictions. Reason blossomed in academies, while superstition thickened in the soil of the people. In this tension the vampire thrived, a figure at once primitive and sophisticated, rural and urbane, feared and secretly desired. Reports of exhumations and hauntings carried by officials and scholars stirred curiosity as well as dread. To some the vampire was evidence of ignorance, to others a warning of mysteries reason had not yet conquered, and to poets and chroniclers it was a shape too evocative to ignore. Pamphlets appeared, their pages heavy with accounts of villagers insisting they had seen their dead walk again. Names of obscure hamlets entered the tongues of distant readers, and the word itself, vampire, vampire, spread like fire in dry fields. For the first time the creature ceased to be bound by dialects, it became a shared presence, its thirst translated into Latin, French, German. Scholars dissected it, theologians framed it as caution, and philosophers mused upon it as symbol. And all the while peasants kept scattering millet, kept tying threads across doors, kept watching the night with the same unease that had birthed the tales in the first place. This widening gaze changed the vampire's face. No longer only the ruddy corpse exhumed with suspicious freshness, it grew into a figure of seduction and menace. The whispering revenant became a shadow lingering by windows, its eyes filled with longing and hunger intertwined. In the imagination of the educated classes, the vampire acquired an almost aristocratic stature, wearing grief like a cloak and hunger like a crown. Its movements became deliberate, its thirst described with an unsettling elegance. Thus the creature ascended from graveyard soil to salons of thought, reshaped not by its own will but by human fascination. Yet beneath this transformation the old truths endured. In villages the vampire still pressed against thresholds, still tugged at names, still hovered where grief remained raw. Stories persisted of revenants that returned not to seduce but to confuse, wandering into barns or kitchens as if lost in the rhythm of old habits. One tale spoke of a man who rose nightly to tend his orchard, pruning by moonlight, though his touch left branches blackened by dawn. Another told of a young woman dead in childbirth, who came back to rock her child in silence, leaving the infant pale and fevered by morning. These were no elegant phantoms, but echoes of love corroded by thirst. The symbolic weight deepened. The vampire was no longer only the question of whether the dead could rise, but whether human ties could ever be cleanly severed. If love and duty could outlast death, could they become hunger? If grief resisted forgetting, could it become peril? The people recognized these questions even if they lacked the words of philosophers. Their rituals were answers of practice rather than theory, woven into the fabric of survival. To tie a knot was to acknowledge both fear and affection. To scatter seeds was to honor the compulsions of the dead without granting them entry. Each act was at once defensive and tender, a small negotiation with forces too immense to name directly. Meanwhile, in courts and cities, fascination turned to art. Poets penned verses of pale figures who walked by moonlight. Composers imagined operas where the vampire's cry echoed over orchestras. The figure became theatrical, its thirst aesthetic, its presence romanticized, and yet, even in these exalted depictions, a kernel of the old dread remained. Audiences thrilled at the terror precisely because they sensed it was rooted in something older, something villagers had once felt at their very doors. The myth carried authenticity, a weight of lived fear that art could not entirely smooth into spectacle. This dual life, the vampire as intimate revenant and as cultural icon, would shape its destiny, for though fascination might gild it, the creature's essence remained tied to the primal fear of unfinished death, of hunger that could not be contained by earth or prayer. Every retelling, however elaborate, carried the same heartbeat beneath: the refusal of silence, the persistence of longing. The vampire thrived because it was never only alien, it was us, distorted, mirrored back through the night's patient glass. Even now, in the glow of rational inquiry, whispers continued. Farmers claimed their oxen collapsed without cause, their bodies marked with wounds no wolf had made. Mothers hushed children with charms, fearing the caress of unseen lips. Dogs still bristled at corners where no shadow ought to be, and those who woke in the night, their chests heavy, their dreams pierced by strange sighs, remembered the old stories and wondered whether fascination itself might summon what it adored. The vampire had found a way to survive beyond graves. In curiosity, in art, in the endless retelling of its hunger. It had become not only a being, but a mirror of human thought, reflecting both fear and desire. And as it settled into this new shape, the question it carried grew sharper. If myths can live longer than bodies, can hunger live longer than either? The centuries ahead would press this question further, shaping the vampire into a figure at once feared, studied, adored and doubted. And so the path stretches onward, from hamlets and sermons into books and salons, and soon into yet greater transformations. For fascination is never satisfied. It deepens, demanding new shapes, new stories, new vessels for the same undying thirst. Fascination, once kindled in the minds of poets and scholars, began to spread like lamp oil across the continent. The 18th century, with its courts glittering and its villages smouldering with old anxieties, became the stage on which the vampire emerged more boldly than ever before. Officials, sworn to reason, found themselves compelled to chronicle the unreason of their subjects, and their documents, dry, bureaucratic, yet tinged with unease, fed the very legend they sought to restrain. In Vienna, reports arrived from Moravia, from Serbia, from distant frontiers, where peasants insisted that the dead walked again. The imperial court, more accustomed to managing grain taxes and border disputes, now wrestled with petitions for soldiers to guard against revenants. It was here in these reports that the vampire stepped firmly into the light of history, though it remained a creature of shadows. The names of real men and women, accused of rising from their graves, were etched into official transcripts. Witnesses swore under oath that corpses lay uncorrupted, their cheeks flushed, their mouths moist with blood not their own. Physicians, summoned to lend rationality, admitted their perplexity, noting the freshness of bodies that should have withered. The empire, reluctantly, found itself tangled in the thread of superstition, its parchment breathing life into the creature it doubted. The people, of course, did not wait for imperial decrees. In those restless provinces, villagers gathered by moonlight, spades and stakes in hand. They exhumed the accused, tested the flesh, and performed the old remedies. Hawthorn through the heart, decapitation, burning to ash. These acts, though sanctioned neither by church nor crown, carried the authority of survival. The vampire had always been a local problem before it was a learned one, and the villagers trusted their rituals over distant pens. Still, the very fact that officials recorded such acts lifted them into a larger story, ensuring that what had once been whispers in barns would echo through academies and courts. In this mingling of peasant ritual and imperial scrutiny, the vampire's identity deepened. No longer only a symbol of personal grief or unfinished death, it became a figure of cultural tension, embodying the struggle between reason and tradition, center and periphery, order and the untamed dark. To the peasants it was simply the restless neighbor. To the empire it became a mark of the wildness of its borderlands, a reminder that civilization was always more fragile than it claimed. But beneath the layers of politics and philosophy, the creature's interiority still pulsed. For in the villagers' eyes, the revenant was never only an enemy. They recognized in its flushed cheeks the persistence of desire, in its uncorrupted flesh the refusal of forgetting. The vampire was terrifying precisely because it was familiar, because it bore the features of kin who should have rested, because its hunger echoed the longings of the living. To banish it was to confront their own grief, their own unfinished loves, their own refusal to let go of what the earth had taken. One tale, recorded in hushed tones, told of a young soldier buried hastily after a skirmish. His mother, unable to attend his funeral, wept each night at her door. certain she heard him call. Soon cattle wasted, children fell ill, and the village whispered his name with dread. When the grave was opened, his face was said to be radiant as though he had merely napped after toil. His lips bore a dark stain. The villagers, torn between pity and terror, ended his hunger with ritual. Yet his mother was found days later still leaving bread at the threshold, as though unwilling to believe the finality of their act. Such stories show that the vampire was always both a curse and a lament, both a danger to be ended and a sorrow to be endured. As fascination spread, poets borrowed these tales and dressed them in silk. They transformed the confused soldier or the grief-haunted mother into figures of tragic grandeur. In verse and drama, the vampire became less a corpse and more a ghost of passion, its thirst described with aching beauty. Audiences, far from the hamlets where graves were watched, shivered with delight at this exotic terror. Yet the transformation was not complete. In the shadow of theatres, real villagers still kept brooms by doors and counted seeds against the night. And so two images of the vampire lived side by side. The revenant of the soil, intimate and dreadful, and the pale aristocrat of art, alluring and haunting. Both carried the same essence, the same refusal to be silenced, the same insatiable hunger cloaked in memory, but one pressed against wooden doors in silence, while the other swept through salons in verse and opera. The vampire, ever adaptable, fed on both kinds of fear, both kinds of longing. The stage was set for a transformation that would carry the creature beyond even the reach of imperial decrees or poetic laments. For myths that survive do so because they adapt, because they find new ways to echo the oldest hungers, and the vampire, cunning as ever, was about to discover that its thirst could spill not only through graves and thresholds, but through entire cultures, binding them with its shadow. The night, watchful, prepared to teach its next lesson. The night, having taught its lessons in soil and song, now carried them into the pages of imagination where the vampire would be reborn again. No longer just the corpse unearthed under moonlight, it became a figure clothed in metaphor, made to walk stages and whisper through verses, yet its essence did not vanish. The hunger that once pressed against thresholds now pressed against the mind, whispering to those who wrote and those who read. The revenant of the hamlet transformed into the stranger of poetry, the pale visitor whose presence unsettled not only homes but the soul itself. In the salons of the 19th century, candlelight flickered across velvet curtains and polished floors, and beneath such refinement, the vampire found new attire. It was imagined less as the bloated corpse of folk belief, and more as a figure of languid grace, a wanderer through boudoirs and gardens. In this new guise, it was not the confused worker who returned to mend fences, nor the mother who rocked her child with fatal tenderness. It was the elegant stranger, aristocratic in bearing, who carried loneliness like perfume and thirst like a hidden blade. Such reinvention did not erase the Slavic soil from which it rose. Rather, it gilded that soil, weaving rustic dread into Gothic fascination. Still, echoes of the old rituals remained, even in this new imagery. The poets who described the vampire as a doomed lover knew, whether consciously or not, that they were shaping the same story the villagers had whispered: love and memory, refusing to let death close its book. The old mother who left bread at the threshold was not so different from the heroine of verse, who longed for her pale visitor even as she faded from his embrace. The form had changed, but the hunger was the same, the unyielding insistence that desire outlasts the grave. Meanwhile, in the villages themselves, the older customs endured. Brooms still leaned against doors, seeds still scattered in moonlight. Reports of revenants did not vanish simply because scholars in cities had grown fascinated by their aesthetic shadows. Peasants still dug into earth, still pierced the hearts of their kin when sickness spread or shadows thickened. For them the vampire was not art, but survival, not symbol but threat. This dual existence, practical dread in the countryside, romanticized terror in the city, gave the creature a breadth no other myth possessed. It lived in bloodied earth and in ink, equally nourished by fear and fascination. The transformation into a cultural figure widened its reach. The vampire became a metaphor for excess, for forbidden love, for the allure of the destructive. Philosophers saw in it the embodiment of unchecked appetite, the refusal of natural law. Artists painted it as a figure both repulsive and mesmerizing, embodying the tension between attraction and revulsion that haunted human longing. And always, beneath these interpretations, the old Slavic heartbeat thudded, the grave restless, the hunger insistent, the night unwilling to let silence stand. In this age, the vampire also gained a new intimacy with power. To imagine it as aristocratic was to paint hunger as privilege, to suggest that those who drained the life of peasants in courts and taxes might also drain in other, darker ways. Thus the myth became a subtle mirror of social fear, casting the vampire as a symbol of predation not just by the dead, but by the living who ruled. The peasants who once scattered millet against revenants might now whisper that their noble landlords carried a similar thirst, cloaked not in shadows but in law. The myth, pliant as ever, absorbed this tension and fed upon it. Yet the creature's interiority remained unchanged. Whether imagined as a peasant risen ruddy from the grave or a nobleman draped in silk, it carried the same solitude, the same exile. In its thirst lay the confession of being cut off from earth, from heaven, from kin, from final rest. To feed was to bridge that exile, however briefly, by stealing presence from another. Its tragedy was not merely that it killed, but that it could not stop seeking. The villagers who staked it and the poets who adored it both recognized this truth, that to hunger without end is its own torment, as pitiful as it is terrifying. And so, step by step, the vampire wove itself into the wider dream of Europe. No longer a rumour confined to graveyards, but a symbol that touched theology, philosophy, politics, and art. It drank not only blood, but meaning, feeding on every fear and longing it encountered. In this adaptability lay its true immortality, for so long as humans wrestled with grief, desire, and the unease of death, the vampire would find a place at their hearths and in their stories. The road ahead promised even greater transformations. From chronicles and poems it would move into novels, into stage and song, into the very marrow of cultural imagination. Each new vessel would change its shape, yet the pulse beneath would remain the same, the night's lesson, the soil's secret, the unfinished cadence of memory. And as fascination deepened, the creature's shadow stretched longer, preparing to step fully into the age where stories themselves became its strongest refuge. Stories once told by firesides began to gather weight like clouds, and soon they broke as novels and plays, thunder rolling through the minds of readers. In the early 19th century, the vampire stepped with deliberate grace into literature, clothed not only in metaphor but in character, given names and voices that carried its thirst into the private chambers of imagination. It was no longer only a rumour of ruddy corpses exhumed by villagers. It had become a figure who could sit in parlours, whisper in corridors, and haunt the long corridors of thought. Writers, drawn to its duality, found in the vampire a perfect vessel for their age's obsessions. Here was a being both intimate and alien, both seductive and destructive. It embodied forbidden longings, the unease of mortality, and the temptation of power. No longer confined to the soil of Slavic graves, it was now transplanted into the gardens of Gothic literature, where it blossomed as both terror and allure. The hunger that had once been described in blunt terms, blood stolen, cattle wasted, children fading, was now embroidered into a language of shadowed glances and moonlit embraces. The figure that emerged was pale, elegant, and deliberate. He lingered in drawing rooms, moved among society with a grace that masked his predation, and carried the loneliness of centuries like a perfume no door could keep out. Yet even in this refined costume, the pulse of older lore remained. The villagers' fears echoed faintly in the silence between his words, in the unease that settled whenever he entered a room. Behind the silken candlelight, one could still glimpse the image of graves disturbed, of mothers laying bread at thresholds, of millet scattered against compulsive counting. The roots of the Slavic earth had not been erased. They simply wore new attire. This transformation unsettled as much as it entranced. Readers found themselves both repelled and drawn, as though staring into a mirror that flattered and accused at once, for the vampire now reflected the anxieties of modern life, the erosion of faith, the allure of forbidden desires, the fear that those who appear noble may harbour hungers destructive to all. It was not only a monster, but a critique, a shadow that followed society into its own bright chambers, reminding it that the night could not be entirely banished. And still, in villages where books did not reach, the old rituals continued. Graves were opened, hearts pierced, bodies burned when sickness spread, dogs barked at shadows, and peasants whispered names with dread. In one world, the vampire wore silk and seduced heroines. In another, it still lurked by barns and wells. Yet these two streams of the myth were not opposed. They nourished one another. The grandeur of literature lent weight to the whispers of villagers, and the stubborn persistence of folk belief ensured that the vampire never lost its edge of reality. Tales carried across borders by books only deepened the fascination. The word itself, once rustic, now glowed with Gothic glamour. But even as it settled into libraries, it remained restless. The vampire had always been more than a story. It was a question gnawing at the edge of certainty. What if death is not an ending? What if grief itself grows hungry? What if love refuses to release the body that holds it, and in doing so becomes perilous? These questions, ancient as the call-born child and the restless grave, now found voice in poetry and prose, their resonance amplified, and the vampire, personified with increasing intimacy, gained new depths of interiority. Writers gave it thoughts, regrets, even a kind of melancholy nobility. It was no longer a mere automaton of hunger, but a being aware of its own torment. This awareness only deepened its power. For what is more unsettling than a predator who knows the cruelty of its thirst and continues anyway? In such portraits, the vampire was both victim and villain, cursed and complicit. Readers shivered not only at its act but at its confession, at the recognition that within themselves lay longings just as unruly. The myth had crossed a threshold. It had become unmoored from geography, entering a universal dream where it could wear any costume, haunt any chamber. Yet the soil of Slavic graves still clung to its feet, reminding it of its birthplace in restless death and unfinished mourning. It carried those whispers into every new guise, ensuring that even as it seduced audiences, it remained anchored in the primal fear of silence broken, of hunger that refused to rest. But myths, like rivers, never stop moving. The vampire, now established in literature, would not rest in salons or between book covers. It would seek new stages, larger still, where performance and spectacle would carry its hunger to yet wider audiences. And as the century deepened, it prepared to walk those stages, to spread its shadow beneath curtains and chandeliers, where entire crowds would feel the weight of its thirst at once. The night was not yet finished with its lesson. Curtains lifted, chandeliers flickered like 100 trembling suns, and the vampire entered the theatre. What had once pressed at thresholds and haunted barns now glided across wooden stages, its presence magnified by the gaze of crowds. Actors wrapped in cloaks of velvet and shadow carried its hunger with solemn elegance, their gestures stylized yet tinged with the raw pulse of folklore. The audience shivered not only at the figure before them, but at the recognition that the tale was older than the walls around them. For even in gilded halls, the vampire carried the soil of restless graves, whispering of hunger that refuses silence. The stage gave the creature a new kind of immortality. No longer bound to whispers or to ink alone, it became spectacle seen by hundreds at once, its thirst woven into song, gesture and scene. Opera houses echoed with its lament. Travelling troupes brought its tale to towns that had never heard of millet. Scattered on sills, the vampire adapted to these new vessels with the same cunning it had shown in fields and courts. It learned to bow, to speak with tragic cadence, to woo audiences as easily as victims. And yet, behind the artistry, its essence did not change. It remained the revenant that demanded recognition, the exile who fed because no door would admit it fully. For those in the crowd, the experience was doubled. They thrilled to the performance, their fear wrapped in the safety of art. Yet when they returned to darkened rooms, to windows rattling in night winds, some wondered whether the story they had applauded was merely play or whether it had awakened something older. Was the vampire on stage a fiction, or a mask behind which the real shadow might linger, waiting for silence to fall? In this way, the theatre carried the myth back into households, making the distance between art and life thin as candle smoke. In novels, too, the creature deepened its hold. Prose allowed it to think, to confess, to reflect in ways no grave-bound rumour ever had. Writers lent it melancholy and grandeur, turning its thirst into a metaphor for exile, for the ache of endless nights. Readers in turn recognised in its lament their own buried longings, the wish for love that outlasts death, the fear of desires that consume more than they give. The vampire had become interior, no longer only a body rising from earth, but a voice speaking within minds. Its torment was felt not just as a tale, but as a shared human ache. And yet, in the villages that still tilled fields by hand, nothing had changed. When livestock waned or illness spread, graves were still opened, ashes still drifted over rivers, threads still tied thresholds, and names were still left unanswered when called at night. The dual life of the vampire continued. In books, a tragic aristocrat. In barns, a practical menace. These worlds rarely touched, yet they both belonged to the same myth, two branches of the same restless root, one fed on imagination, the other on fear, and together they ensured the creature's survival. What fascinated both peasants and poets alike was the vampire's paradox. It was both intimate and estranged, both kin and predator, both memory and threat. Its thirst was cruel, yet its persistence evoked pity. To strike it down was both justice and sorrow, for in every revenant lay a faement of someone once loved. On stage, this paradox unfolded as tragedy, cloaked in song. In fields, it unfolded as ritual, cloaked in necessity. The creature lived in both, nourished by tears of pity and by ashes of fear. In time, the vampire became a figure not only of horror, but of reflection. To audiences, it posed questions beyond its thirst. What do we do with grief that refuses to end? What are the costs of desires we cannot master? What happens when love itself grows dangerous? When memory demands more than the living can give? These questions, older than empires, lingered in the silence after curtains fell, and in the quiet after graves were closed. The vampire asked them without words, its presence alone a reminder that the boundary between love and hunger is perilously thin. Thus, as the 19th century deepened, the myth became ever more entwined with the human condition. It was no longer only about restless death, but about the restless heart, about the persistence of longing in a world that insists on endings. The vampire walked across pages and stages with elegance, but its footsteps still echoed with the weight of poppy seeds, with the silence of unanswered names, with the old soil that first gave it birth. The night, ever patient, prepared its next lesson. For the vampire, nourished now by both ink and ritual, by both fear and fascination, was not content to rest even in art. It would continue to adapt, to slip into each new vessel humanity offered, to reflect whatever shadows lingered in the soul of its age. And in that reflection, it would remind all who listened that hunger, once awakened, never entirely sleeps. The vampire, no longer confined to whispers of villages or flickering stages, began to stretch across the vast map of the imagination. The 19th century, restless with invention and upheaval, offered fertile soil for its hunger. Steamships crossed oceans, trains threaded landscapes, and with every new path opened, stories travelled alongside cargo and letters. The revenant, born in the dark earth of Slavic graves, now rode iron rails and sailed across waters, carried in the minds of readers, the voices of actors, the ink of poets. Its shadow lengthened with each mile, until it was no longer a provincial figure, but a traveller of the world. In the drawing rooms of London, in the salons of Paris, in the candlelit gatherings of Vienna, the vampire appeared as both guest and intruder. Its presence was cloaked in aristocratic elegance, but behind the silk and lace, the same hunger throbbed. It crossed borders as easily as rumours, carrying with it the old signs of recognition, the flush of the corpse, the uncorrupted flesh, the thirst that made kin into prey. Yet each culture gave it a new costume. To some it was a metaphor for decadence, to others for corruption of power, to others still for forbidden passions. Always it adapted, always it survived, but the soil of origin still clung to it. In Balkan villages, in the forests of Poland and the riversides of Russia, the vampire remained practical, immediate, threatening. Graves were opened, rituals performed, thresholds guarded. Peasants still whispered of neighbours who returned too ruddy, of children born with calls who might never sleep easily in their coffins. These practices did not fade simply because cities had adopted the vampire as art. The two streams of the myth ran parallel, one as lived fear, one as aesthetic fascination. The creature drank deeply from both. It was in this duality that the vampire gained its deepest interiority, for in one guise it was a tragic noble, cursed with eternity and loneliness. In another, it was the restless worker, the grief-burdened mother, the soldier buried hastily. The myth allowed both faces to coexist, because both were true. Hunger wears many forms, and exile speaks in many tongues. The vampire's torment was not singular but universal. It was the ache of memory, the cost of desire, the refusal of endings. This multiplicity ensured that no matter the stage or the soil, the figure remained recognizable, always both near and far. One tale whispered through the Carpathians tells of a monastery where monks, fearful of unrest, kept vigil by graves at night. They prayed, they sang psalms, they scattered holy water. Yet when the sickness did not abate, they uncovered a corpse said to be smiling faintly, as though amused by their efforts. They struck it with iron and burned it. Yet in the ashes a single tooth gleamed white as bone untouched by flame. That tooth, the story says, was kept as a relic, hidden in a carved box, carried from one abbey to another. Even in sacred halls the vampire found ways to linger, to remind the faithful that some hungers mock both prayer and fire. Such stories deepened the symbolic weight. The vampire was no longer only a threat to bodies, but a challenge to authority itself. If prayer could fail, if reason could falter, then the creature stood as a rebuke to certainty. It represented the persistence of doubt, the fragility of order, and yet, paradoxically, it also reinforced ritual. For each time it was said to rise, the community responded with sharper faith, stronger rites, more fervent prayers. In this way, the vampire became both adversary and teacher, pressing the living to affirm their boundaries, their beliefs, their vigilance. But even as it tested rituals, it also revealed vulnerabilities of the heart. In literature and theatre, the vampire became increasingly intimate, no longer merely a shadow outside the door, but a guest within, a confidant, even a lover. Its thirst was portrayed as both terrifying and tender, an embrace that was death yet felt like belonging. Here too the Slavic root remained, the mother who returned to cradle her child, the husband who lingered by the window, the neighbour who wandered barns. Love and hunger entwined, impossible to separate. What the city imagined as seduction was the same paradox villagers had always known, that those we cherish may also destroy us if they cannot let go. The 19th century delighted in such tensions, and the vampire thrived as both spectacle and meditation. It was read in parlours, sung in opera houses, whispered in fields, feared at gravesides. Its adaptability proved its strength. For unlike other monsters bound to specific places or times, the vampire fed on what all humans share: the dread of death unfinished, the ache of longing unfulfilled. And so its journey pressed forward. Having conquered whispers, chronicles, stages, and salons, the creature turned its gaze toward new frontiers of storytelling. The printed word would give it permanence, the spoken tale immediacy, but another age was approaching, an age of images, of moving shadows that could stretch across nations. The vampire, patient as ever, waited at the edge of this new invention, ready to claim it as another vessel for its endless hunger. The age of images arrived like a second dawn, and the vampire, ever restless, stepped eagerly into its glow. Shadows no longer belonged only to the earth or the candle's flicker. They now lived on silver screens, dancing for audiences who gasped in collective wonder. The creature, who had once pressed its face against wooden doors, now leaned close to thousands at once, its thirst magnified by light that moved. Cinema, with its silence and its suddenness, proved the perfect vessel for a being that thrived in gesture, in suggestion, in the tension between presence and absence. Early films painted the vampire with stark strokes, its figure angular and unsettling, a silhouette that seemed less human than shadow incarnate. Here was no refined aristocrat, but something closer to the corpse of folklore, a body twisted by hunger, gaunt as famine itself. In these portrayals, the old Slavic dread re-emerged, stripped of velvet, clothed instead in pallor and claw. Viewers trembled not because of eloquence, but because of recognition. The creature on the screen resembled the restless dead whispered about in hamlets, the figure villagers once exhumed with spades under moonlight. It was not fantasy, but nightmare resurrected. Yet cinema, like literature before it, soon gave the vampire new dimensions. From grotesque shadow it evolved again into elegance, a figure draped in dark coats, eyes gleaming with intelligence. As much as appetite, actors lent it dignity, even allure, their gestures weaving both menace and charm. Once more the paradox surfaced. Predator and seducer, corpse and noble, terror and fascination. The vampire thrived because it was never only one thing. It could be both the bloated body exhumed from soil and the tragic immortal whispering of loneliness. Each image fed the myth, each interpretation sustaining its restless immortality. Audiences carried the vampire with them. When they left theatres, children clutched at parents, adults glanced at shadows differently, and the old unease returned in new shapes. For though the images were flickering illusions, the questions they raised were ancient. What if death does not rest? What if hunger lingers where silence should be? What if love itself becomes destructive when it refuses to release? These questions followed viewers into their sleep, reminding them that cinema's shadows were only the newest language for the oldest fears. Meanwhile, in villages untouched by projectors, the rituals persisted. Farmers still scattered seeds, families still tied red threads at doors, priests still muttered blessings over graves suspected of unrest. For them, the vampire was not an actor nor a flicker of light, but a practical danger, an explanation for sickness and sorrow. The coexistence of these worlds, the screen and the soil, gave the myth a strange vitality. It could belong both to superstition and to spectacle, both to the silence of barns and the noise of theatres. Few creatures could live so easily in both realms. In these portrayals, the vampire's interiority deepened further. Filmmakers gave it silence that spoke volumes, pauses heavy with longing, gestures that conveyed not only hunger but weariness. The creature became more than a monster. It became a mirror of human exile, of the ache of eternity, of the curse of endless desire. Its torment was no longer shouted, but shown in glances, in shadows stretching too long, in the hesitation before the final bite. In this restraint lay its power, for audiences sensed the creature's suffering, and in that suffering saw fragments of their own unquiet longings. What fascinated was not only the feeding, but the refusal. In some tales, the vampire resisted its thirst or loved those it endangered, or mourned the solitude its hunger imposed. Such portrayals reminded all who watched that evil is never simple, that hunger itself can be pitiful. The vampire, even at its most menacing, carried the echo of humanity, and it was this echo that made it enduring. To kill it on screen or in story was never to banish it completely, for its shadow lingered, reminding viewers that within every human heart dwells some appetite unruly, some grief unwilling to end. Thus, as the century turned, the vampire's myth grew vast, spanning graveyards, books, stages, and screens. Each new vessel added a layer, yet none erased the oldest truths. Beneath the velvet and the flickering light, beneath the philosophy and the art, there remained the simple dread of the restless dead, the ancient habit of scattering millet, the silence of names unanswered at the door. The vampire was many, yet always one, hunger shaped into story, exile given breath. And as cinema expanded, carrying the creature across oceans into cultures that had never known Slavic graves, the vampire grew more universal still. It became a global wanderer, feeding not only on blood, but on imagination itself. Wherever there were shadows, it could dwell. Wherever there was longing, it could speak. The soil of its origin had taught it patience, and now it carried that patience into a world newly bound by moving light. The night, ever watchful, allowed this transformation with the same quiet inevitability with which it had allowed the first whisper at a threshold. For the vampire's journey was not yet complete. Larger stages awaited, ones that would give it not only voice but permanence, ones that would test whether fascination itself could be stronger than fear. The creature, restless as ever, prepared to step into them. The century's reel of light had given the vampire a new body, but with each appearance it revealed something older within, a mirror not only of fear but of humanity's inner restlessness. By the middle of the 20th century, the figure had become inseparable from questions of identity, morality, and desire. No longer just a shadow of superstition, it began to serve as a vessel for deeper meditations, what it means to hunger without end, to exist outside time, to wear loneliness as a second skin. The vampire had moved from the soil of the grave to the stage of the world's imagination, and yet in every new mask the trace of its Slavic origin pulsed like an old heartbeat beneath the floorboards. Writers and filmmakers returned again and again to its torment. They gave the creature long silences in which it gazed at the living with eyes filled not only with appetite but with sorrow. In those moments, audiences felt pity as much as dread. The vampire, once driven by raw compulsion to count seeds or knock at doors, now seemed aware of its curse. It questioned itself, sometimes resisting its thirst, sometimes confessing the unbearable ache of exile. The myth, in expanding, had not weakened, it had deepened. To embody hunger is one thing. To know the cruelty of that hunger, and to continue feeding, is another, and far more haunting. Yet while art refined it, folklore never released it. Even into the modern age, rural whispers spoke of the unquiet dead. Villagers in the Balkans or Carpathians still told of shadows that pressed at windows, of animals that shied from certain crossroads, of graves where the earth heaved strangely. These accounts, though rarer, carried the same weight as ever, for they tied the present back to the oldest truths. They reminded listeners that the vampire was not only an invention of stage or screen, but a story that had once justified the opening of graves, the scattering of seeds, the tying of knots. The persistence of such rituals, even whispered in memory, kept the myth anchored to its soil. What grew clearer in this era was the creature's symbolic reach. The vampire came to represent not only grief or unfinished death, but broader anxieties about disease, about forbidden love, about power that preys in silence. It was cast as a metaphor for exploitation, for desire that consumes, for the ways society itself can drain those it claims to protect. In these shapes, the vampire became almost prophetic, warning of dangers that wore human faces. And yet, beneath every new meaning, the ancient hunger still beat steadily, the longing for life to continue, for desire to outlast mortality, for love to cling even when the grave has closed. The vampire's interior world, once absent in rustic dread, was now explored in detail. Writers spoke of its loneliness, of centuries passed in silence, of memories that never faded. Some imagined it yearning for companionship, even tenderness, though every embrace risked destruction. Others portrayed it as weary of existence, longing for the oblivion it once rejected. These portrayals gave the creature a tragic dignity, making its predation not less terrible but more complex, for audiences sensed the paradox, that within its cruelty lay suffering, and within its exile lay a reflection of their own unquiet hearts. Still, one could not forget the older image. In the Slavic grave, the vampire remained a body that refused decay, lips flushed as though from stolen breath, teeth sharp against the earth. That image endured beneath every romantic mask, a reminder that no matter how adorned, the creature began as a corpse that would not stay buried. It is this tension between the ruddy revenant of the soil and the pale noble of imagination that gives the vampire its lasting power. It embodies the truth that stories like the dead refuse to remain still. And as the 20th century pressed on, the myth spread farther still. It crossed into every genre: horror, romance, allegory, even comedy. The vampire proved inexhaustible, able to change tone without losing essence. This adaptability was not accidental, but born of its very nature. Hunger has no single face. It wears whatever mask will let it feed. In this way, the vampire mirrored humanity itself, shifting, searching, never entirely at rest. The question of its existence, whispered from the first, also changed shape. Fewer believed in graves that stirred, yet many sensed in themselves the truth of its hunger. Was the vampire real? Perhaps not in flesh, yet in metaphor, in desire. In the quiet ways longing unsettles the heart. It walked everywhere. To doubt its body was not to doubt its meaning. And so it lingered, present in imagination, in ritual, in art, refusing to fade even in an age that claimed to have banished superstition. The night, patient as always, did not resolve the question. Instead, it allowed the creature to move with ease between realms, part superstition, part symbol, part story, part shadow. Each generation shaped it anew, but none dismissed it fully, for the vampire, with its mingling of hunger and sorrow, spoke too directly to the condition of being human. And as the century darkened with wars, displacements, and new kinds of fear, its shadow lengthened once more, preparing to remind the world that some hungers outlast even fire and ash. Wars tore the century open like wounds in the earth, and into those wounds old fears crept back with renewed strength. The vampire, already a wanderer across books and stages, found new life in the silence left by catastrophe, in bombed-out cities where rubble smoked and families searched for names among ruins. The idea of the restless dead no longer seemed so distant. Death had come too quickly, too abundantly, and the rituals of farewell often could not be performed. Graves were shallow, unmarked, hurried. In such neglect, the ancient suspicion stirred once more that when the living fail to honor the boundary, the dead may return to remind them. Soldiers spoke of seeing shadows move where no enemy stood. Refugees whispered of dreams in which their lost kin called them by name, voices insistent in the dark, and though the age of reason claimed to govern, the old symbols quietly re-emerged, a red thread tied at a wrist, a sprinkle of salt at a door, a whispered charm against hunger that walks unseen. Such gestures lingered like small anchors in seas of uncertainty. The vampire in this time of upheaval reminded all that grief unfinished and unmarked has a way of returning with teeth. Yet in art, the figure took on a different gravity. Filmmakers, painters, and writers used the vampire to explore the disquiet of a world that seemed unable to rest. In its endless hunger, they saw the reflection of ideologies consuming nations, of tyrannies draining the lifeblood of peoples, of violence that fed endlessly without satisfaction. The vampire became both metaphor and memory, embodying the exhaustion of survival in a century that seemed to know no end to thirst. And still, beneath these grand metaphors, the intimate truth remained, that to imagine the vampire was also to imagine the neighbor lost too soon, the family buried without farewell, the grief that resisted silence. The creature itself, when personified, seemed to shift tone in these years. Gone was the confident aristocrat draped in velvet. In his place appeared figures weary, disillusioned, almost spectral with fatigue. These vampires spoke less of seduction and more of endurance. They wandered ruins, haunted not with desire alone, but with sorrow too heavy to bury. In their faces, audiences saw both predator and victim, both curse and confession. To look at them was to feel the chill of history itself, demanding remembrance. Still, in quieter corners of the Slavic world, the old customs persisted. Villagers in remote regions still watched graves with unease, especially those dug hastily or without blessing. They remembered that the vampire was never only a symbol, it was once a presence tested with spade and fire. For them, the myth's endurance was not explained by metaphor, but by experience, by the sense that some deaths are too jagged to lie flat. Even if officials dismissed such tales, the people held to them, for myths are not easily exiled from soil where they have taken root for centuries. What united the old rituals and the modern art was the same thread, the recognition that hunger outlasts the body. In war, in peace, in fields or in theatres, the vampire embodied the same truth, that what is unresolved does not stay buried. Memory itself, if left unquiet, can rise like a revenant, pressing against doors waiting for an answer. To ignore this was to risk haunting. To confront it was to acknowledge the shadow we each carry. As the century advanced, the vampire adapted again, this time to the bright glow of popular culture, no longer only confined to the somber tones of Gothic literature or the eerie silences of film. It began to appear in pulp magazines, in radio plays, in stories told quickly and consumed eagerly. Here it gained speed, vitality, even glamour. It was less weary and more cunning, less a lament and more a thrill. Yet in every guise, the trace of the Slavic revenant remained quiet but insistent. The corpse that refused to rot, the hunger that would not end, the door that creaked with a name left unanswered. The vampire had always been both mirror and mask. In this turbulent century, it reflected humanity's exhaustion, its endless cycles of destruction, its inability to find true rest, but it also masked those truths, offering them in a form that could be consumed safely, as entertainment, as art, as legend. To watch the vampire on screen was to grapple indirectly with the thirst of history itself, the losses that could never be fully reckoned with. And so the myth survived not only because it frightened, but because it comforted. It gave shape to the formless ache of grief. It made hunger visible. It allowed people to name what otherwise might have remained unspeakable. The night, faithful as ever, carried the myth onward, shaping it into forms that future generations would inherit. For the vampire was never finished. It always stood ready to wear the next mask, to embody the next fear, to whisper the next unanswered question. And as the modern world grew noisier, brighter, faster, the creature only waited more patiently in its shadows, prepared to remind the living that beneath the light, the old soil still remembers. The modern world, with its glass towers and electric brilliance, seemed at first to have no place for shadows. Cities pulsed with neon, streets glowed with unbroken light, and science declared the dominion of reason. Yet in that very brilliance, the vampire found another guise, no longer only the revenant of the grave or the aristocrat of lonely manors. It slipped into the metaphors of modernity itself. It became the hunger of cities, the exhaustion of endless labor, the seduction of glamour that consumes as it dazzles. The myth adjusted, as it always had, to echo the unease beneath progress. Writers of the late 20th century gave the vampire voices shaped by this new world. It appeared in urban alleys among skyscrapers, in the restless hum of nightlife. The figure once bound to castles and graveyards now rode subways, leaned in nightclubs, wandered lonely apartments. Yet for all the change in scenery, the old pulse remained. It still pressed against doors, still longed for entry, still reflected humanity's refusal to let go of desire, grief, or memory. Beneath electric signs and humming wires, it was the same revenant that had once been feared in Carpathian barns. This era also emphasized its allure. The vampire was imagined less as grotesque, more as magnetic, a figure whose beauty and danger were indistinguishable. Its feeding was no longer described only as horror, but as intimacy, terrifying. Yes, but also desired. Here, the oldest paradox found new expression. The same hunger that destroys also promises belonging, even ecstasy. In this guise, the vampire embodied the modern confusion between love and consumption, between pleasure and peril. What villagers once feared in a mother's lingering embrace, audiences now saw in romanticized figures who kissed as they killed. Yet the myth never lost its darker core. Beneath the silken portrayals, echoes of the soil remained. Scholars noted that these modern reinventions were only elaborations of the same truth, that the vampire arises where boundaries are broken. In old villages, it was the grave disturbed or the ritual neglected. In modern cities, it was the human self unsettled by desires it could neither master nor silence. Both pointed to the same lesson, that what is unresolved always returns, that hunger denied grows sharper in the dark. In art, this complexity deepened the creature's interiority. Modern vampires spoke in voices filled with irony, regret, even love. They mourned their solitude, confessed their guilt, and yet continued to feed. Their awareness did not free them. It only made their torment keener. The audience, confronted with such figures, found themselves both pitying and fearing them. The vampire had become not merely a monster but a tragic companion, a reflection of what it means to be bound to impulses stronger than will.
Meanwhile, in the rural corners where superstition still whispered, stories endured. Children were told not to wander after dusk, lest a shadow call their name. Old graves were avoided, especially those of suicides or strangers. These whispers, though faint, kept the link alive between the romanticized vampire of novels and the practical revenant of folklore. Both belonged to the same continuum, two faces of the same enduring hunger. Even in an age of satellites and screens, the old soil remembered, and in its memory the myth found shelter.
One story from a remote village spoke of a man who returned from the city after years away, only to die suddenly in his sleep. His relatives buried him quickly, without the full rites, for the priest was absent. Days later, her children swore they saw him at the edge of the woods, his face pale, his lips moving as though whispering their names. Livestock sickened, shadows lingered near thresholds, and soon the old remedies were performed. Fire, iron, prayer. To outsiders it seemed superstition, to the villagers it was survival. The 20th century, with all its modernity, had not banished the vampire. It had only given it new costumes. This tension between myth and modernity gave the creature extraordinary resilience. In one world it was an icon of literature, romance, cinema. In another it was still a presence to be feared in silence. The vampire thrived precisely because it straddled both realms, never fully reduced to symbol, never fully dismissed as superstition. It remained both story and possibility, both fiction and fear, and in that liminal space, it grew more potent than ever. The question of its existence shifted accordingly. Some asked not whether vampires walked the earth, but whether they lived in us, in our desires, in our griefs, in our compulsions that consume what we love. Others still looked at restless graves, at unexplained shadows, at voices heard in sleep, and whispered that perhaps the old tales still held truth. The myth offered room for both answers, feeding on certainty as well as doubt. And so the vampire continued. As the century turned and the world quickened, it adapted to the rhythms of cities, as once it had to the silences of fields. Always it waited, always it reflected, always it reminded the living that hunger once named never disappears. The night, stretching endlessly, prepared the next chapter. where the creature would not only haunt stories but begin to shape cultures that no longer remembered the soil from which it first rose. The century tilted into new rhythms. Screens grew brighter, stories multiplied, and the vampire, never one to waste an opening, stepped into this chorus of voices with sharpened poise. It became a creature of television, of paperback novels read on trains, of late-night films that flickered across glowing boxes in living rooms. The myth had become portable, intimate, accessible to every household, no longer confined to the grandeur of opera houses or the solemnity of rural ritual. It whispered now through antennas and pages, its hunger folded into the fabric of everyday life. This intimacy reshaped its nature once again, to appear nightly on a screen. To be consumed in serial stories required the vampire to become familiar without losing its edge. And so it grew into a paradox more striking than ever, both monstrous and sympathetic, both terrifying and alluring. Its thirst became a metaphor not only for ancient griefs but for modern compulsions, the endless appetite for consumption, for power, for intimacy without consequence. In every household where it appeared, it held a mirror quietly, reminding the living that hunger takes many shapes and is never far from their own lives. Yet even in this new guise, the Slavic soil whispered beneath. Scholars traced its lineage, pointing to the rituals of millet, the counting of seeds, the restless graves of forgotten villages. Writers who studied the myth acknowledged its Balkan heart, its deep entanglement with grief and superstition. Though the modern vampire wore sleek clothes and spoke with eloquence, it carried the weight of centuries. In its silence, one could still hear the murmurs of mothers leaving bread at thresholds, the bark of dogs at unseen presences, the rustle of spades in midnight earth. These echoes, subtle yet enduring, tethered the creature to its origin. Even as it became a citizen of the world, audiences began to expect more from it than fear. They longed for its confession, for its loneliness, for its tragic dignity. To watch it was not only to tremble, but to feel compassion for exile itself. The vampire became less of an intruder and more of a companion in imagination, someone whose torment could be understood, even if his hunger could not be forgiven. This softening did not erase the terror, it deepened it. For to pity what also prays is to blur the line between victim and predator. The myth thrived in that blurring, feeding not only on dread, but on empathy. Yet, as always, outside the bright hum of screens, the darker face endured. In isolated regions, tales still surfaced of the unquiet dead. Farmers in remote valleys told of livestock failing without cause, of footsteps where no one walked, of graves suspected to heave after burial. To them the vampire was no symbol of urban alienation, nor a romantic hero. It was the same revenant their ancestors had feared, a presence that demanded ritual to keep at bay. The myth's endurance lay precisely in this duality, the ability to live as both superstition and symbol, as both neighbour and stranger. In this age, the vampire's interiority was explored with unprecedented depth. Writers described its centuries of memory, the burden of watching generations rise and fall, the ache of carrying secrets no one else remembered. It became almost a historian of sorrow, a custodian of forgotten griefs. In its eyes lay the record of empires collapsed, loves abandoned, prayers unanswered. Its thirst was not only for blood, but for connection, for release, for meaning that might balance eternity's weight. And still, despite all this reflection, it fed, reminding audiences that knowledge does not always heal, that awareness does not always absolve. This paradox made the vampire more enduring than ever. It was not only the shadow outside the window, but the presence within the heart, the symbol of what cannot be silenced, the hunger that accompanies memory. Each retelling renewed its relevance. Each reinvention confirmed that the old soil's lesson had not been forgotten. For beneath every costume, the vampire remained the same exile, carrying both menace and sorrow in its gaze. And as the world raced toward an age of global storytelling, With voices and images shared instantly across continents, the vampire waited patiently. It knew that new forms of narrative would only widen its reach, that every change in technology would open another vessel for its hunger, from the scattered seeds of villages to the glowing pixels of screens. Its journey was always the same, to find new ways of pressing at thresholds, of whispering names in the night. The night itself, vast and unhurried, seemed to guide this expansion, as though determined that the creature should never fade. For myths endure not because they resist change, but because they embrace it, carrying their core unchanged into each new shape. The vampire, ever faithful to its own hunger, stood ready to embrace what came next, and the living, whether knowingly or not, prepared once more to welcome it. The vampire, having slipped so easily into the glowing screens of living rooms, soon found itself called to even greater stages. The final decades of the 20th century and the dawning of the 21st gave it unprecedented reach. The stories travelled faster than ever before, woven through satellites, broadcasts, and later the boundless threads of the digital web. No longer confined to local myths, to novels cherished in dim libraries, or to films watched in darkened halls, it became a global traveller, its hunger now familiar on every continent. In this new reach, it did not lose itself, it multiplied. Audiences in distant lands, who had never walked among Slavic graves or heard whispers of millets scattered at thresholds, now recognized the figure instantly. They knew its pale skin, its thirst, its promise of eternal night. Yet what they consumed was not wholly new. Beneath the surface shimmered the old root. Even if they did not know of ruddy corpses exhumed from Balkan soil, they sensed the same dread, that death may not rest, that desire may corrode love, that hunger may linger longer than any farewell. The Slavic revenant had been dressed in countless costumes, but its ancient gaze looked out from each. In these years, the vampire reached a peculiar height of intimacy with humanity. It was not only a figure of fear, but one of longing, even aspiration. Stories painted it not merely as predator but as companion, guide, sometimes even as savior. Its immortality was envied as much as its thirst was feared. People imagined what it might mean to live without time's erosion, to carry centuries of memory, to walk endlessly under the stars. And yet every such imagining circled back to the same truth. The cost of such endurance was hunger, and hunger could not be silenced without taking from another. This duality, envy and fear, gave the myth a new kind of resonance. It was no longer only a tale told to warn children or to explain illness. It had become a meditation on desire itself. To be drawn to the vampire was to be drawn to the dangerous truth that what we most long for may also undo us. In this way, the old story of the mother who returned to cradle her child, feeding until the infant waned, found new life in tales of lovers who embraced even knowing the kiss was death. The settings changed, the costumes varied, but the ache beneath remained identical. Still, in quiet villages, in places where modernity's glare had not yet washed every shadow, the ancient rituals endured. Graves were still tended with care lest unrest be stirred. Candles were still lit for those who died suddenly, unblessed or far from home. These gestures, small and solemn, carried the weight of centuries. They spoke the same truth as the sleek novels and films, that endings are fragile, and that the dead sometimes press back against silence. Even if no one admitted to fearing vampires outright, the rituals themselves testified that somewhere in the marrow of memory, the old fear persisted. In modern art, the vampire's interiority deepened into something like philosophy. It reflected on its place in the world, on the meaning of hunger, on the loneliness of endless years. Writers gave it soliloquies. Filmmakers lingered on its silences. Actors played it with both menace and regret. Audiences, watching, could not dismiss it as mere monster. They saw in it a mirror of themselves, of every longing unfulfilled, of every grief carried too long, of every desire that threatened to consume more than it gave. The vampire became less an intruder and more a companion of thought, a shadow that walked alongside humanity, whispering of the cost of its own restless striving, and yet its menace never vanished. The vampire remained capable of terror, of destruction, of unsettling the calm of hearth and heart. Its fascination was precisely this, that it could not be made harmless, no matter how much pity it inspired. It was always both the hunger and the confession, the predator and the victim, the grave and the embrace. To love it was to risk ruin. To fear it was to admit its kinship. As the world entered the digital age, the vampire prepared once more to change its mask. Stories would no longer be confined to printed pages or glowing screens in theaters. They would spread through networks, into countless homes, carried on glowing devices, woven into the rhythm of daily life. The vampire, patient and enduring, knew it would find sustenance there too. For as long as humanity tells stories, it tells of hunger, and as long as hunger exists, so does the vampire. The night, vast and unblinking, seemed to lean closer, as if preparing to whisper the next chapter. The creature's journey was not yet finished. Its shadow stretched farther still, ready to remind the living that every age, however modern, carries with it the same ancient unease, that silence can break, that endings may fail, that the dead may not be content to rest. The digital age arrived not with whispers, but with a constant glow, and into that glow the vampire stepped as though it had been waiting. No longer bound to the ritual of theatre or the solitude of books, it now lived in countless fragments, shared through networks, reimagined in images, streamed into homes at any hour. Its shadow travelled faster than ships or trains had ever carried it, crossing borders instantly, entering bedrooms through glowing screens, small enough to hold in a hand. For a creature whose essence was entry, invitation, and the crossing of thresholds, this was its perfect realm. Here the vampire shed and donned masks with dizzying speed. It appeared as tragic hero, as monstrous revenant, as romantic lover, as symbol of power, even as parody of itself. And yet, through every retelling, its heart remained unchanged. Always it pressed against the boundary. Always it embodied hunger that refused rest. Always it asked the same questions. What if endings do not end? What if desire cannot be silenced? What if memory itself grows sharp enough to wound? The modern audience, scattered across continents yet united by light and signal, recognized the figure at once, whether or not they knew of the Slavic soil where it had first risen. The myth in this vast expansion grew strangely intimate. It was no longer only a story told collectively in theatres or villages. It became personal, private, carried in headphones, whispered into solitary nights. Individuals found themselves not only watching the vampire but speaking with it, identifying with it, confessing through it. For in this new world of isolation within connection, the vampire's loneliness struck a deeper chord than ever. Its exile mirrored the exile of modern lives, surrounded yet alone, linked yet longing. Its hunger mirrored the endless appetites of an age that consumes without rest. Still, the echoes of its origin could not be erased. Even in digital retellings, there remained the imagery of graves, of ruddy corpses, of thresholds and seeds. Scholars trace the persistence of these motifs, noting how they resurfaced again and again, even when modern tales clothed them in new garments. A vampire might now walk in skyscrapers, yet its essence remained tethered to the old soil, where villagers once scattered millet and left bread at doors. The digital age had not undone that history. It had only translated it into new languages of light and sound. In these retellings, the creature's interiority reached a kind of fullness. It was no longer simply feared or admired. It was heard. Its voice carried confessions of sorrow, of regret, of centuries endured without release. It reflected on its own hunger, sometimes resisting it, sometimes surrendering, always aware of its curse. This interiority made the vampire almost unbearably human, not because it lacked monstrosity, but because it revealed how close monstrosity lies to longing. To listen to it was to hear the echo of griefs that cannot be buried, of desires that cannot be satisfied, of memories that cannot be forgotten. And yet, for all its empathy, the menace remained. The vampire could not be fully domesticated, no matter how many sympathetic portrayals it wore. Its essence was still transgression. The crossing of lines meant to remain inviolate. It still reminded the living that what they fear most is not the other, but themselves, their own appetites, their own griefs, their own restless refusal to let go. The vampire thrived because it was not alien at all, but familiar, a reflection so close it startled when recognized. In rural places where rituals persisted, the digital age did not erase the old gestures. Graves were still blessed, thresholds still guarded, stories still whispered of names called in the dark. These practices might seem quaint to the modern eye, yet they carried the same wisdom as ever, that silence must be honored, that the boundary between life and death must be tended carefully. Even if most dismissed belief in literal vampires, the persistence of these acts testified to a deeper recognition that myths endure because they guard truths too immense to ignore. Thus, as the vampire adapted to the new age, it became more resilient than ever. It was no longer confined to one culture, one art, one generation. It was global, protean, capable of endless reinvention, and yet always anchored to the Slavic heart of its origin. In its many forms, it carried the same lesson, that hunger outlasts bodies, that grief resists endings, that memory, once awakened, cannot be silenced. The night, observing quietly, seemed to allow the creature this wide dominion, for myths do not fade in brightness. They grow sharper, their shadows clearer, their questions more urgent, and the vampire, timeless in its patience, knew that even in a world glowing with artificial day, darkness would always return, and with it the old ache that calls it forth. Its journey was not yet over. It had more to teach, more to mirror, more to remind, and as the digital hum deepened, the creature leaned closer still, ready to press against thresholds newly built of glass and light. The vampire, whose presence had now infiltrated every medium of story, began to reveal itself in subtler ways beyond the page or screen. It became a cultural pulse, a metaphor invoked in politics, in philosophy, in economic. Commentators spoke of corporations as vampiric, draining lifeblood from labor, of addictions that fed like revenants upon the body, of systems that consumed without giving back. In each case, the word carried the weight of centuries, summoning not merely a monster but the image of hunger that never ends. The Slavic revenant, born in whispers around graves, had become a symbol vast enough to critique the structures of an age. Yet even in these abstractions, the creature's intimacy was not lost. The vampire was still imagined as a face, pale and sorrowful, or fierce and predatory, pressing close in the dark. To call something vampiric was not only to describe exploitation, it was to conjure the image of closeness that devours. The myth retained its intimacy, even as it widened its scope, reminding all who invoked it that hunger is not impersonal, but personal, not distant, but near. Stories of this time often painted the vampire as more self-aware than ever. It was written as one who recognized its curse, who questioned the morality of its hunger, who sought redemption yet rarely found it. This self-awareness reflected humanity's own age of reflection, when people questioned their consumption, their desires, their responsibilities. In giving the vampire a conscience, storytellers gave voice to the unease of an era that knew it was feeding on the world's lifeblood, yet could not stop. The vampire, long a mirror of desire, had now become a mirror of guilt. Still, the folklore endured, quietly, beneath the layers of reinvention. Scholars travelling through remote Balkan villages in these years still found traces of the old belief. They recorded families who placed iron near graves, who avoided certain burials at crossroads, who whispered of the unquiet dead. These customs did not make headlines, but they persisted, like roots beneath soil. They ensured that the vampire was never only symbol, never only metaphor. It remained, at least for some, a literal presence, possible, feared, dangerous, This coexistence of literal fear and symbolic meaning gave the myth its unbreakable strength. It could inhabit two worlds at once: the modern imagination that saw in it commentary on society, and the ancestral memory that saw in it a real threat pressing at the boundary of the grave. In both it remained the same hunger, the same unease that life and death are not neatly divided. And so the vampire's interiority grew heavier. It became not only a figure of loneliness, but a figure of responsibility. Stories gave it choices, temptations, moments of resistance or surrender. It became a stage for the drama of morality itself. What do we do when our hunger harms others? Can desire ever be reconciled with love? Can memory ever be reconciled with rest? These questions, spoken through the vampire's voice, lingered with those who listened. They made the creature more haunting than any scream in the dark, for they revealed that the true terror was not in its fangs, but in its likeness to the living. In this age, even science sometimes entertained the metaphor. Medical studies of rare conditions, porphyrias, wasting diseases, plagues, were likened to vampirism. Though researchers dismissed the creature as legend, they could not escape its language. To explain anomalies, they reached for the word vampire, proving once again that the myth had carved itself so deeply into thought that even reason could not wholly push it aside. And while the world's light grew brighter, while networks connected every place to every other, the night itself did not vanish. There were still hours when silence thickened, when shadows leaned long, when the old fear returned unbidden. In such hours the vampire was remembered, not as a metaphor, not as a symbol, but as a presence that might still be near. The rational mind dismissed it, yet the heart knew otherwise. Myths do not endure without cause, and the vampire, patient, continued to wait in that tension between disbelief and dread. Its story was approaching another turning. For myths, like creatures, move through cycles: birth, growth, transformation, confrontation. The vampire had grown vast, had transformed endlessly, had confronted both villagers and nations. Now, as the 21st century deepened, it prepared to remind humanity of its final lesson, that hunger is not merely an old superstition, but a truth woven into existence itself. The creature, still pale, still restless, still waiting at thresholds, leaned nearer once more, ready to show how its tale and the tale of humanity were one and the same. The 21st century, restless and sleepless, carried the vampire into yet another age of transformation. Its pale face appeared not only in stories told in the dark, but in the endless scroll of glowing devices, in the fragments of narrative shared across digital seas. It was no longer bound to volumes or theatres, but scattered, multiplied, woven into the fabric of culture so completely that one could forget where story ended and myth began. The vampire's hunger now mirrored the world's own, an age of ceaseless consumption, of endless desire, of constant longing for more. In these years, it grew into a paradox both sharper and more subtle than ever. On one hand, it became nearly omnipresent, romanticized, reimagined, softened into a companion of longing hearts. On the other, it retained the old menace, the whisper of graves unsettled, the fear that silence might break. Beneath the romance lingered the revenant, the corpse that refused rest, the figure that pressed against the fragile boundary of death. The audience, whether aware or not, still carried that ancestral tremor, passed down through centuries, that the unquiet dead do not always stay buried. The global fascination with the vampire revealed something profound about humanity's own interiority. To embrace such a figure was to admit attraction to the very thing feared. To imagine life eternal was to accept the weight of hunger eternal. Stories of this time reflected that dual pull: the vampire as lover and as predator, as savior and as curse, as mirror of yearning and as embodiment of doom. Each portrayal revealed the same truth that villagers once whispered when scattering seeds at thresholds: that desire and danger cannot be separated, that what is most beloved may also be what destroys. Even science, in its clinical certainty, could not banish the metaphor. Researchers compared viruses to vampiric presences, feeding on hosts, replicating endlessly. Cultural critics spoke of economies as revenants, drawing lifeblood without giving rest. In every field, the language of the vampire persisted, a reminder that this ancient myth was not only a story, but a lens through which humanity understood its own compulsions. The Slavic revenant, born of fear and ritual, had become a universal symbol of hunger unchecked. And yet, for all its abstraction, the intimate figure endured. People still dreamt of pale faces at their windows, still woke at night with the sense of being watched, still left offerings at graves out of habit they could not explain. In remote corners of Eastern Europe, whispers persisted of sudden deaths, of bodies suspected of rising, of rituals quietly performed to keep the peace of the dead. These stories did not vanish in the glow of modernity. They lingered like embers beneath ash, faint yet unquenchable. The vampire remained both global and local, both symbol and presence, both myth and possibility. In art, its interior voice deepened further, no longer only confessing loneliness. It now spoke of its role as witness to humanity's transformation. It remembered the shift from village fields to crowded cities, from candlelit rooms to glowing screens, from whispered prayers to endless chatter. It carried centuries in its gaze, centuries of griefs repeated and desires unchanged. To hear its voice was to hear continuity itself, the reminder that though ages change their garments, hunger remains the same. And in that recognition lay both comfort and dread. Audiences, listening, could not help but feel kinship. The vampire was no longer a stranger at the door, but a reflection in the glass, a shadow overlapping their own. To imagine its hunger was to acknowledge their own cravings, whether for love, for power, for eternity, or for escape. This was the creature's greatest transformation, to reveal that its story was not apart from humanity, but within it. The vampire had always been a mirror, and now the mirror shone more clearly than ever. Yet in this closeness, the menace sharpened. For if the vampire is kin, then its curse is kin as well. Its hunger is humanity's hunger, its exile humanity's exile, its endless search humanity's reflection. To embrace it fully is to admit that what is feared in the grave may already live in the living. And this realization, subtle yet piercing, carried the myth forward, ensuring its endurance in an age that fought itself beyond superstition. The night, watching patiently, allowed these revelations to settle like dew. The vampire, ancient and unhurried, remained poised at the threshold, neither fully within nor fully banished, ready to step where it was invited. And though the modern world rushed faster than ever, though it flooded itself with light, there was always stillness between pulses, darkness between glows. In that stillness, the vampire waited, as it always had, preparing to remind the living that hunger is eternal, and that myths, like shadows, lengthen as the light grows brighter. By the time the vampire had become a constant shadow in the global imagination, its story was no longer just a tale of graves and revenants, nor simply the fiction of novels and cinema. It had become something larger, something woven into the living world itself. To speak of it was to speak of boundaries between life and death, between desire and restraint, between memory and forgetting. It was not only a creature, it was a language of unease, a way humanity named what it could not resolve. And in this form, it gained an immortality beyond even its own legend. In Slavic lands, where the first whispers had risen, echoes of ritual still lingered. An old woman might still scatter seeds near a threshold, or a candle might still burn at a grave in the weeks after a sudden death. These gestures, small and unspoken, carried with them centuries of memory. They were not performed with spectacle, but with quiet conviction, as though part of the body itself remembered the danger. In such acts, the vampire remained more than story. It was a possibility still feared, even if never named aloud. Meanwhile, in cities of glass and stone, the myth evolved into metaphorical breath. Economists spoke of vampiric systems draining lifeblood from the poor. Psychologists compared addictions to vampiric hungers, relentless and consuming lovers, describing a passion that left them trembling, reached instinctively for the image of the vampire's kiss. In each case, the creature slipped between literal and symbolic, proving that it did not need to walk the earth to haunt it. The myth itself was presence enough. Yet stories told in hushed corners reminded listeners that perhaps the literal presence had never left. In villages struck by sudden illness, whispers rose. Perhaps someone had been buried wrongly. Perhaps a spirit had not been laid to rest. In lonely homes, people still claimed to feel the brush of a hand at night, the whisper of a name at their window. These accounts rarely made their way into books or screens, yet they carried the same unease that once led villagers to open graves and strike corpses with stakes. The rational age did not fully erase the irrational tremor of the heart. And within the stories that reached millions, the vampire's voice grew deeper, more contemplative. No longer content with being a predator or even a tragic hero, it became almost a philosopher. It questioned the meaning of its own curse, reflected on centuries of human history, mourned what it had seen lost. It embodied memory itself, the refusal of the past to be forgotten, the insistence that every wound, however ancient, still bleeds. In this role, it became a guide of sorts, though a guide who offered no comfort. To follow it was to recognize that some hungers never end, and that to live is to carry both longing and loss. The audience, listening, found themselves reflected in this creature more than ever before. Its exile resembled their own sense of isolation in a world more connected, yet more lonely than ever. Its hunger echoed their own endless striving, for love, for success, for permanence in a fleeting age. Its immortality mirrored their own secret wish to escape time, even as they feared the cost. The vampire, once an enemy outside the door, had become a mirror held steadily in the dark. But the mirror, though calm, was never safe, for to see oneself in the vampire was to admit that the line between human and revenant is thinner than comfort allows. Hunger, grief, desire, these are not foreign curses but familiar companions, and if such things, when left unquiet, can give rise to the revenant, then perhaps the vampire has always existed, not only in graves or stories, but in the shadows of the living heart. Thus the myth reached a stage of completion and transformation all at once. It was both everywhere and nowhere, both literal and symbolic, both feared and desired. It no longer needed to prove its existence in flesh to prove its truth in meaning. Its survival was assured not by graves disturbed, but by the endless human need to name what haunts them. And so it endured, waiting in silence, not for proof but for recognition. The night, stretching unbroken, seemed to lean nearer still, as though aware that the story's arc was bending toward conclusion. The vampire, patient as ever, did not hurry. It had walked through centuries of superstition and ages of invention. It had taken on the faces of monsters and lovers, of strangers and mirrors, and now it prepared to reveal what it had always been meant to show, that its tale is not only about whether it exists, but about why humanity continues to call it forth. The silence deepened, carrying with it the suggestion that the creature's next revelation would be more intimate than any before, as though the veil itself was ready to lift. The revelation, when it came, was not thunderous but quiet, as though the vampire had always intended to whisper, rather than proclaim, across centuries of myth, ritual and reinvention. Its truth had been constant. It was less a creature stalking graves than a shadow cast by human longing itself. To fear it was to fear hunger that refuses to be satisfied, grief that refuses to be buried, memory that refuses to fade. In this way, the vampire was never only outside the door, but always within the heart, a companion of the living as much as of the dead. The Slavic roots of the legend shone clearly in this light. Those who scattered seeds at thresholds, who burned candles at graves, who drove stakes into earth, they were not only defending against a monstrous revenant, they were enacting rituals that acknowledged something profound, that endings are fragile, that life and death are not neatly divided, and that the living carry with them unfinished ties to the departed. The vampire was the form those unfinished ties could take, given body and hunger. To guard against it was to guard against the ache of incompletion itself. And as centuries passed, each culture that inherited the myth reshaped it, but never erased its essence. The aristocrat of Gothic fiction, the romantic hero of modern novels, the philosopher monster of cinema and digital tales, all carried in their marrow the soil of forgotten graves, the whispers of villagers who feared what returned in the night. Every reinvention was a mask placed upon the same ancient face, a face that looked back with sorrow as well as hunger. Now, in the 21st century, the vampire's duality seemed sharper than ever. On one hand, it was a global icon, endlessly adapted, endlessly consumed. On the other, it remained a local whisper, a superstition lingering in places where silence still deepened after dusk. To hold these two truths together was to understand its endurance. The vampire thrived precisely because it was both myth and memory, both fiction and fear, both a mirror and a presence. It needed no proof to exist. It existed in the human need to name what haunts them. This realization gave the vampire's interiority an almost sacred weight. To imagine its thoughts was to imagine centuries of grief carried without rest, centuries of hunger that no feast could sate, centuries of watching the living change while remaining forever unchanged. Its immortality was not triumph but torment, its hunger not pleasure but compulsion, its survival not freedom but bondage. And yet in that torment lay its power, a symbol for who among the living does not know what it is to long without end, to carry sorrow that time cannot dissolve. The Slavic villagers who first told these tales might not have spoken of such philosophy, but their rituals carried the same knowledge in action. By scattering seeds, they acknowledged that hunger must be diverted. By guarding graves, they admitted that memory is restless. By fearing the unquiet dead, they confessed that grief is never silent. In their own way, they had always known what later storytellers would put into words, that the vampire is not only a monster, but a truth dressed in shadow. And so the myth, having travelled through centuries, revealed itself less as a story of others than as a reflection of humanity itself. To ask if vampires exist was to ask the wrong question. The better question was, in what form does the hunger live among us now? In what ways do we drain and are drained, love and are consumed, remember and are bound? The vampire's presence answered by existing wherever desire outlives restraint, wherever grief outlasts comfort, wherever endings prove incomplete. The night, listening, seemed to nod in acknowledgement. For myths endure not by demanding belief, but by offering mirrors, by showing truths that the living would rather not name. The vampire, pale and patient, had become such a mirror. It waited at every threshold, not always to enter, sometimes only to remind. And in that reminder lay its immortality. For as long as there is longing, it will remain. But the story was not yet finished. Though much had been revealed, though centuries had been walked, there was still more to say. The vampire, carrying its weight of symbols and sorrows, leaned closer to whisper the lessons of its legacy, the way it continues to shape lives, the way it lingers in rituals unspoken, the way it will never entirely fade. The tale, drawing toward its close, prepared to settle into reflection, where the creature would be seen not only as revenant of the past, but as shadow of the present. The vampire's legacy, by now, had grown into something that transcended story and even symbol. It had become ritual memory, woven so deeply into the fabric of human thought that its presence was felt even where its name was not spoken. In Eastern Europe, in villages where the soil still held echoes of ancient fears, families maintained quiet customs, lighting candles for the restless, avoiding the paths of sudden deaths, leaving crumbs or drops of water for unseen guests. These actions, seemingly small, were not always named as protections against the vampire, yet they carried the same weight, as though the body remembered what the mind might deny. Elsewhere, the vampire's shadow lived in language itself. To describe exhaustion, people said they felt drained. To speak of those who took too much, they said they sucked the life from others. The words, casual and modern, still carried the old root. Without even realizing, people echoed the same fears that once led villagers to scatter seeds by doors. The revenant had become a way to speak of imbalance, of the places where life was taken without return. Its immortality lay not only in tales, but in the very phrases of the living. This subtle endurance revealed the vampire's greatest power, its ability to remain unseen yet present, denied yet acknowledged. In the bright modern age where disbelief seemed natural, its figure might be dismissed as fiction. And yet, in quiet corners, in sleepless nights, in whispered expressions, it lived on. Humanity might laugh at its existence, yet still feared the shadows, still checked the lock on the window, still shivered at the sound of a name spoken in the dark. Belief was not required. Unease was enough. In this endurance, the vampire took on almost the quality of a teacher, not a benevolent one, but a severe reminder. It showed that hunger cannot be erased by denial, that grief cannot be silenced by progress, that memory does not vanish because it is inconvenient. Its lessons were harsh but faithful, and they persisted through every generation. Those who studied it academically, those who adored it romantically, those who whispered of it in superstition, all were learning the same truth in different forms, that the vampire is the name given to the unending. Its interior voice, as imagined in modern stories, seemed to lean into this role, no longer simply lamenting its curse. It spoke of what it had witnessed, of what it understood about the living. It pitied their denial, their rush to bury what was unresolved. It envied their brevity, their ability to forget, their gift of endings. But it also knew that endings were never complete, that every life left shadows, that every desire left echoes. It saw itself as the embodiment of those echoes, the keeper of unfinished songs. To listen to its voice was to hear time itself refusing to close. And so the vampire remained, both feared and needed. Feared because it reminded humanity of death's proximity, of hunger's persistence, of love's dangerous edge. Needed because it gave form to what otherwise would have no name. To speak of the vampire was to speak of the darkest truths indirectly, to dress them in shadow so they could be faced without despair. This was why the myth endured when others faded. It offered not escape from fear, but a way to hold it gently, in story, in ritual, in metaphor. The Slavic heart of the myth pulsed beneath all this, steady and unforgotten. Its graves, its prayers, its whispered warnings gave birth to a figure that the world carried forward endlessly. Every adaptation, every reinvention was still rooted in that soil, still tethered to those nights when villagers guarded doors and fields against the revenant. No matter how global the vampire became, its essence could always be traced back to those ancient fears, those quiet rituals, those fields where shadows lengthened at dusk, and the night itself, eternal and unbroken, seemed to honor this persistence. It held the vampire close, as though the creature belonged not to any one age but to time itself. In every culture, in every retelling, in every whispered fear, the vampire survived because it was never only a monster. It was hunger, grief, memory, endless companions of the living. To deny it would be to deny a part of humanity's own shadow. To acknowledge it was to admit that the story of the vampire is inseparable from the story of humankind. The silence deepened, preparing for the final descent. The tale, vast and patient, was bending toward conclusion, toward reflection that would gather all its threads into one final truth. The vampire, pale and watchful, lingered still at the threshold, waiting for the last act to unfold. The vampire's presence, after so many centuries, seemed less like a tale carried forward, and more like a condition of existence itself. It no longer asked for belief in graves that stirred or corpses that rose. Instead, it lived in the human recognition that some hungers are never silenced, that some ties are never broken, that some shadows are never dispelled. To call it by name was not always necessary. It lingered unspoken in rituals, in fears, in the quiet gestures that revealed humanity's instinctive awareness of the unfinished. In Slavic lands, this awareness still flickered most clearly. Old cemeteries, ringed with birch trees and iron fences, bore traces of the vigilance of generations. Some graves bore marks of stones laid heavy on top, as though to pin what lay beneath. Families still tended to the dead with prayers and offerings, not only out of love, but out of quiet caution, remembering that the line between rest and unrest was never absolute. These acts spoke not only of reverence, but of an unbroken thread of fear, that the dead, when unsettled, could still return. At the same time, in cities humming with neon, the vampire had become a symbol of longing and allure, painted in stories of desire that consumed even as it gave. It reflected the modern unease with love itself, love that can be both nourishing and devouring, tender and destructive. The vampire's kiss, once imagined as a monstrous act of feeding, now carried the paradox of intimacy, closeness, so complete it risked annihilation. Humanity, in embracing this vision, revealed that it understood the old truth in new language, that what is most beloved is often bound with danger. Through all these guises, the vampire remained unchanged at its core. Its immortality was not merely in stories, but in the human heart's refusal to let go of certain questions. What happens when grief is denied? What becomes of desire that overreaches? What is the cost of refusing endings? Each age answered in its own way, but the figure of the vampire was always there, embodying the questions so they could not be ignored. Its imagined interiority grew heavier in these reflections. To picture the vampire's mind was to picture centuries of bearing witness, of standing at the edge of wars, of wandering through cities that rose and fell, of listening to prayers in languages now forgotten. It was a being that could not move forward, yet could never vanish, caught in the space between memory and hunger. Its curse was not only to feed, but to remain, a shadow stitched to time. To hear it speak in stories was to hear the voice of memory itself, refusing silence. And perhaps this was why the myth endured even where belief had faded, for what the vampire represented could not be outgrown. Progress could light streets and scatter shadows, but it could not erase the knowledge that hunger lives within, that grief follows behind, that memory clings. The vampire gave form to these truths, so that humanity could face them without despair. It was not merely superstition but survival, not merely fiction but reflection. The Slavic villagers, who once guarded their homes with millet and prayers, might not have foreseen their revenant wandering across the whole world, yet they would have recognized the essence. They too knew that death was not always silent, that desire could devour, that memory could bind. Their stories, born in fields and forests, had become the language of a global imagination, and still, beneath every retelling, their soil remained, their rituals whispered. Thus the vampire, ancient and ever renewed, prepared its final revelation. It had been seen as monster and lover, as symbol and shadow, as curse and confession. Yet none of these masks was its true face. Its true face was humanity's own, reflected back with hunger and sorrow sharpened. To tell the story of the vampire was always to tell the story of the living, their struggles with endings, their unease with desire, their refusal to forget. The night, endless and calm, seemed to gather this truth like a cloak. The story, vast and unhurried, was nearing its final breath. The vampire, patient as ever, lingered at the threshold of its tale, ready at last to close the circle, not with terror, but with the quiet reflection it had carried from the beginning. The final chapter waited, where myth and meaning would meet, and the creature's presence would be understood in full. The vampire, long watched and whispered about, no longer needed to appear at the window or scratch at the threshold. Its work was complete. the moment it entered the human imagination, and there it would remain. In Slavic nights, beneath stars that stretched like silver threads over silent fields, it had been born from grief, fear, and longing. Now it lived not only in darkened graves or in half-forgotten villages, but in the very marrow of human thought. It was no longer confined to borders or boundaries. It was woven into the texture of human story. And what then was its final gift? Perhaps it was this: the reminder that nothing humanity fears or desires ever truly disappears. The vampire was the embodiment of unfinished business, the shadow of hunger that could not be dismissed, the presence that lingered after the song ended. It was the face of memory made flesh, a testament to the truth that the past is never gone. Those who spoke its tale were not merely entertaining themselves with horrors, but keeping alive the recognition that life is fragile, that death is porous, that love and grief are threads entwined. Imagine the vampire at this last moment, not as a beast clawing from a grave, but as an ancient figure watching quietly from the edge of the world. It bears eyes heavy with centuries, yet not entirely cruel. Within them lies the sorrow of endless hunger. Yes, but also a reflection of every human gaze that has ever turned toward the unknown. In its silence, it confesses that it never asked to be born, that it was called forth by need and fear, by the human refusal to accept endings. Its immortality was not chosen, it was given, and it bore it as one bears a burden. The Slavic soil that first knew its steps still holds the echo of that burden. The birch trees, guardians of the graveyards, stand tall, their roots drinking from earth layered with centuries of prayers and doubts. The wind that moves through them still carries fragments of chants, once whispered to ward off the restless dead. Though the villages change, though the old cemeteries crumble, that undercurrent remains. The vampire is not an intruder there. It is a mirror of the land's own memory, its own inability to let go of what has been. And so the question rises one last time: do vampires exist today? The answer is both simple and endless. Not in the form the villagers once feared, perhaps, not in the corpse stirring beneath a mound of earth, not in the pale figure crossing the threshold at night. Yet in another way they exist more strongly than ever. They are in the stories spoken across the globe, in the images cast upon screens, in the metaphors whispered between lovers, in the chill that runs through the body when one considers desire too deep or grief too strong. The vampire is not a creature bound to a grave, it is a truth bound to humanity. This endurance is not accidental. Myths survive only when they still speak to the soul, and the vampire's voice remains clear. It tells of the longing to hold on, to never lose, to drink life endlessly, without surrender. It warns of the danger of desire that knows no limit, of memory that clings too tightly, of hunger that devours itself. In this, the vampire is both curse and counsel, both terror and teacher. It shows humanity what it fears most, and in doing so, helps it endure those fears. Thus the circle closes. From the graves of Slavic soil, through centuries of stories and transformations, to the restless modern heart, the vampire has walked unbroken. It began as a shadow feared at the edge of the village, and it ends as a reflection carried within every human who has ever grieved, hungered, or desired beyond measure. It has never truly been about blood. It has always been about the endlessness of the human soul. And now, in this final silence, one may let the image settle. The night stretched wide, the fields at rest, the birches still, and in the distance a figure fading, not destroyed, not triumphant, simply abiding. The vampire does not vanish, for it never truly came. It remains as all myths remain, as a shape in the imagination, as a lesson wrapped in shadow, as a companion in the dark. So ends the story, with no need for fear, only reflection, for in the vampire's tale we see ourselves, our hunger for life, our refusal of endings, our longing to endure, and in recognizing this we may find peace. The night closes softly, the story folds upon itself, and the vampire, eternal in memory, returns to its quiet rest.